Welcome to my YouTube channel, Acquire American English with Alex. Today we are going to get into the meaning of a poem. It's called My Shadow, and it's written by Robert Louis Stevenson. I'm a certified English teacher to help learners learning English as a foreign language. I do one-on-one sessions as well as group classes, and I make these YouTube videos to help you understand the English language in a deeper way. Poetry is a great way to learn English on a deeper level when you look at things like metaphors and symbolism and figurative language. Fluent speakers often use figurative language, so the more you learn about how to use English metaphorically, the more fluent you will become. Thank you so much for joining me today. So I'm going to start with a reading of the poem. It's more like kind of a song I made with the poem. And then after that, I'm going to go into the meaning line by line and talk about the literal meaning as well as the figurative and the metaphorical meaning as I see it. So let's get into it.
I have a little shadow that goes in and out with me, and what can be the use of him is more than I can see. He's very, very like me from the heels up to the head, and I see him jump before me when I jump into my bed. The funniest thing about him is the way he likes to grow, not at all like proper children, which is always very slow. For he sometimes shoots up taller like India rubber ball, and he sometimes gets so little that there's none of him at all. He hasn't got a notion of how children ought to play, and can only make a fool of me in every sort of way. He stays so close beside me, he's a coward you can see. I think ashamed to stick to Nursey as that shadow sticks to me. One morning very early, before the sun was up, I rose and found the shining dew on every buttercup. But my lazy little shadow, what an errant sleepy head, had stayed at home behind me and was fast asleep in bed.
So My Shadow by Robert Louis Stevenson. This poem was written a long time ago, so there is some language that isn't as relevant today as it probably was back then, which I can explain and get into. But let's get started with the first stanza. The first stanza begins with, I have a little shadow that goes in and out with me, and what can be the use of him is more than I can see. Now, a lot of readings of this poem see the speaker as being a small child, probably a little boy, since there's so many he's and I's in the poem. It signifies that he's probably talking about his shadow. And it's a little shadow. So little meaning he could be a small boy and have a little shadow that goes in and out with me. That might mean when he's inside, the shadow's inside. When he goes outside, he still sees the shadow. It's always with him. And what can be the use of him is more than I can see. The child is questioning, what's the point? Like, why do shadows exist? That's a question. It's a very childlike, a very curious childlike question to ask. Why do we have shadows? And he's paying attention to it. He's very curious. And then he goes on to describe more. He is very, very like me from the heels up to the head. So the heels being the back bottom of your foot up to your head, meaning he's like me. From the heels up to the head, your shadow looks like you, but it's only this dark outline of what your body looks like. So he's very, very like me. He looks like me. And I see him jump before me when I jump into my bed. So this makes me imagine that maybe it's bedtime and he opens the door to his dark room, and the hallway light is on behind him. So it projects a shadow onto his bed that he then goes and gets into bed for nighttime. So that would be a literal interpretation of the first stanza. Let's look at it more metaphorically, more figuratively, more symbolically. So a little shadow that goes in and out with me. So another way of looking at the shadow could be the shadow self. So when we think about the shadow self in psychology, they talk about it as this unconscious part of yourself that is kind of like your emotional blind spot. I think a more popular way of looking at the shadow self is sort of like the parts of ourselves that we deem unacceptable, or maybe the negative side of ourselves. If you think about Star Wars or something like that, where there's the good and the bad, the light side and the dark side. So this shadow self embodies everything that is the dark side, everything that could be deemed bad or evil. And it's a little shadow, which goes to say with the same theme that it could be like from a child's perspective, the curiosity of the shadow self. And what can be the use of him is more than I can see. So if the shadow self, you don't understand why it's there, like what's the point of having this dark side of ourselves where we're trying to be good people, or this little boy's like, I'm supposed to be good all the time. Why do I have this dark side of myself that wants to do bad things? He is very, very like me from the heels up to the head. So the shadow side looks just like me. I can't tell the difference. Like the shadow side is me. I am the shadow side. It just depends on whether I act on maybe those negative emotions or those unseen emotions. I see him jump before me when I jump into my bed. If the shadow side represents the unconscious, when we sleep and we dream, that's when our unconscious kind of comes awake and alive and tries to speak to us through our dreams. So he jumps before me when I jump into my bed. So when I go to sleep and I dream, like the shadow's already in my bed. It's like waiting for me. My unconscious is waiting for me to go to sleep so that it can try to communicate with me. That's the first stanza. All right, let's jump into stanza number 2. Stanza number 2 starts with, the funniest thing about him is the way he likes to grow, not at all like proper children, which is always very slow. So when you think about it, literally, from a child's perspective, when you're growing, it takes forever. You just want to be an adult tomorrow, but time seems to drag on forever. And he's talking about the shadow doesn't grow that way. And then reading further, for he sometimes shoots up taller like India rubber ball, and he sometimes gets so little that there's none of him at all. So the shadow grows so quickly, like when the sun is setting and your shadow gets longer and longer, and then in the middle of the day your shadow shrinks to being like right underneath you. At high noon, when the light is directly above you, your shadow is very small. So he's comparing the shadow growing like a rubber ball. When you throw a rubber bouncy ball on the ground, it bounces up really high. So if you have like a light that suddenly shines on you, your shadow just grows super quickly, and you turn the light off and the shadow disappears. So that's kind of like the literal reading that I have for that. If we look at it more symbolically, more metaphorically, the funniest thing about him is the way he likes to grow. So it's like the shadow side of yourself grows, but not in the same way that our conscious side grows. Like we need to, be reading books and learning and going to school and slowly getting smarter or slowly acquiring knowledge. But the speaker, or the child that's speaking in the poem, is saying that the shadow grows differently than the slow pace at which, we learn in life and that we grow as people. Either literally, like our bodies grow, or, more figuratively, like we're growing and, learning about life. For he sometimes shoots up taller like indeed a rubber ball, and he sometimes gets so little that there's none of him at all. So it could also be, if the shadow side, like from the psychology perspective, is this unknown emotion, that this unconscious emotion that you don't realize is there, but then something triggers you, and then all of a sudden maybe you're filled with this anger, and you're not an angry person, but you're really angry, and it just grows, it just comes out of you, and then it just goes away. You could just go back to the person that you are after you move through that emotion, and you're like, where did that emotion come from? So that could be, a metaphor to the shadow self from a psychological perspective. Let's move on to stanza number 3. He hasn't got a notion of how children ought to play and can only make a fool of me in every sort of way. So a notion of how children ought to play, notion meaning he doesn't understand, like he doesn't get it. He doesn't understand that children play in this way. He just has no clue. He's a fool. He makes a fool out of me in every sort of way. So he's feeling like this shadow is making a fool of him. And so, like, why is he making a fool of him? He stays so close behind me, he's a coward, you can see. I think ashamed to stick to nursey as that shadow sticks to me. So he's so close behind me, it's like he's kind of clinging to him. If you have children playing on the playground and one is just following someone else around, they're just like, go do your own thing. Stop copying everything that I do. So he's calling his shadow a coward, as if it was another child on the playground. And then I think ashamed to stick to nursey as the shadow sticks to me. So stick to nursey, I think that's kind of more of like an older term that's not really used, but like you're acting like a baby, you could say. So the shadow is acting like an infant baby that needs to be so connected to someone, like needs a constant connection. And so he's embarrassed because he's like, I'm trying to grow up and not be a kid anymore, and I want to be an adult tomorrow, and the shadow is acting like a baby, and it's embarrassing. So if we look at it through more of a figurative, metaphorical, symbolic lens, and we think about the shadow side of yourself, like the things about you that maybe you don't like, the reflections of that. Being a kid on the playground and being the kid that like feels uncomfortable or feels insecure or is out of place with the other kids is not gonna help you make friends. That can be a really scary place to be as a child on the playground. You want to be confident. You want to appear to be confident. So this could be the shadow side of this child being like, this part of me exists. I get insecure sometimes, and sometimes I get clingy and I need support, as if I did when I was, a baby or something like that. And so he's calling this part of himself a coward and shameful. Okay, so let's move on to the final stanza. One morning very early, before the sun was up, I rose to find the shining dew on every buttercup. It's early in the morning, the sun hasn't risen yet. Sometimes in the morning there'll be little droplets of water on flowers, and a buttercup is a type of flower. And also I rose, like you rose, you rise, you lay down and you get up, you rise. But rose is also the name of another flower, which is very symbolic for love and passion. So that's kind of interesting. So he woke up, he rose, and he found the shining dew. So why water shines when light reflects on it. So it must be the stars or the moon is still out, so you can see the shine on the dew before the sun comes up. But my lazy little shadow, what an errant sleepy head, had stayed at home behind me and was fast asleep in bed. So at night, it's dark, it's just full of shadows. And sometimes you can't even see the shadows because you need light to see the shadow. And so because he's awake in the night, there are no shadows. So he's walking around and he can't see his shadow. There's no shadow. Looking at it through more of a metaphorical lens, this could be something in the poem where the child has thought about his shadow self. Like the first stanza is like, I can't get rid of this thing. Why is it here? The second stanza, it grows in this way that I don't understand. It's so strange. It's not a way that I understand, that I grow. And then there's this shame around it. So there's all this reflection and curiosity about the shadow, and there's confusion and shame and kind of anger towards it. But in this last stanza, there's not really any anger here. An errant sleepy head, it's kind of a playful way to speak about the shadow, when before he was kind of making fun of him or talking down to him or like being upset about him. And he stayed at home behind me and was fast asleep in bed. Knowing that the shadow self is still there, but choosing not to, engage with it or embrace it and sort of loving it. Like there's parts of ourselves that maybe we don't like. And when they come up, we can talk very negatively to ourselves about the parts of ourselves that we don't like. And then that can make us feel bad. But whether or not we are nice to ourselves or mean to ourselves about the parts we don't like, they're still a part of us and they'll always be a part of us. So kind of being at peace with the parts of ourselves that we don't like is kind of like what maybe is happening in this last stanza in the poem. That's my reading of My Shadow by Robert Louis Stevenson. You can find a transcript of this video on my blog. The link will be in the description below. And if you found this video useful, please like and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time.